Everybody thinks they know the Nazi gold story. Buried treasure, hidden vaults, maybe a conspiracy or two. But the actual history isn't some adventure tale. It's a geopolitical catastrophe that stripped General George S. Patton of his authority and quite possibly took his life. When Patton cracked open the Third Reich's financial backbone, he wasn't standing over a war trophy. He was staring at a diplomatic landmine that led straight back to Swiss banking houses and Allied governments alike. Patton pushed for full exposure. Washington demanded the opposite. What followed was a collision that erased billions from the record and ended with a death no honest investigator has ever fully explained. The whole thing began with pure chance. April 1945. Military police flagged a jittery French woman near the Mercers salt mine. She mentioned trucks rolling through the darkness on the tarps.
Hours later, Patton soldiers were standing before a reinforced steel vault door buried 300 feet beneath the earth.
Behind it, something cold, something metallic, something none of them had a name for yet. They blew the door, and what waited on the other side defied every expectation they carried down that shaft. 250 tons of gold bullion, every bar stamped with the Reich eagle, arranged in rows so meticulous, so deliberate, that this was clearly no desperate last-minute stash. Someone had engineered this over years. Because that's exactly what had happened. Beyond the gold, 8,000 paintings looted from museums and private homes across occupied Europe. Rembrandts, Rubens, works ripped from the Louvre, from apartments in Warsaw, from family collections in Amsterdam. All taken, all catalogued, all hidden. Hundreds of millions in foreign currency representing every nation Germany had swallowed. Diamonds, jewels.
Entire numismatic collections of staggering rarity.
And then, something that froze every man in his tracks. Hundreds of small pouches, each one labeled, each one sorted with bureaucratic care, each one packed with gold teeth and fillings extracted from the mouths of death camp prisoners. The entire financial engine of the Third Reich, buried while the country above it disintegrated into ash. Guarded by two aging soldiers who dropped their weapons the instant they saw American uniforms. Not a single round fired. Patton descended personally. He walked that mine for 2 straight hours.
The officers beside him would later say they'd never witnessed anything like it. No bluster, no profanity, none of the explosive showmanship the world associated with his name. Just a man moving slowly between towers of stolen gold, pausing before a painting, picking up a document, barely speaking a word. When he surfaced, he issued 3 orders, immediately. And those 3 orders reveal precisely who Patton was when no journalist was scribbling notes and no camera was pointed at his face. First, a full armored perimeter around the mine. Nobody enters or exits without his personal clearance. Patton had lived around armies long enough to understand one absolute truth. Put soldiers next to treasure, and the outcome is never clean. Second, a complete inventory of everything underground. Every canvas, every gold bar, every sack of dental fillings, every scrap of currency, documented with obsessive precision, not as a logistical formality, as evidence. Evidence of atrocities that Patton was determined to preserve before the diplomats arrived and started negotiating things into silence. Before the post-war dealmakers buried the uncomfortable parts along with the dead. Third, an urgent direct communication to Eisenhower's headquarters. Come now, see this with your own eyes, because this changes the shape of everything. Eisenhower arrived 48 hours later alongside General Omar Bradley. The 3 of them descended together in a narrow elevator that Patton later called genuinely terrifying in his diary. Consider the weight of that admission. A man who had absorbed gunfire, survived bombing runs, and stared down death a dozen times across 4 years of open warfare, a man who never once confessed to fear of anything, called a mine elevator terrifying. They reached the bottom. They walked through the vault.
They saw the bullion, the stolen masterpieces, the neatly organized bags of teeth pulled from murdered civilians. Eisenhower said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke. He wanted the entire world to witness this, every last piece of it, because he was already anticipating the deniers, the ones who would surface years later, insisting none of it was real. He wanted to eliminate every possible crack in the record. Patton agreed without hesitation. And here is something genuinely rare, a moment where Patton and Eisenhower stood on identical ground. Their relationship was famously strained, fractured by ego, by disagreement, by fundamentally different instincts about how wars should be fought and ended. But on this single point, no daylight separated them. Expose it all. Force the world to look. Make denial impossible. Patton had journalists and photographers hauled to the mine within days of the discovery. He personally arranged for sitting members of the United States Congress to fly in, walk through that vault, and witness the gold, the paintings, and the bags of human teeth with their own eyes. Because Patton grasped something most generals never did. Wars aren't only decided on the front lines. They're decided by the narratives that survive afterward. And he was hell-bent on making sure this narrative got told, loudly, completely, and by enough witnesses that no one could quietly smother it later. Newsreel cameras rolled over the stacked bullion. Photographs hit newspaper front pages across America. For roughly 2 weeks in April 1945, the Merker's mine became the most famous location on Earth. Patton was the man who cracked it open. And for a brief moment, everything appeared simple and clean. Then Washington told him to pump the brakes. Because here's the chapter of this story that almost nobody tells. The chapter that explains how a discovery this massive, this visceral, this historically staggering, managed to evaporate from public memory so quickly and so thoroughly. That gold didn't simply belong to Germany. An enormous share of it had been looted from Poland, from Czechoslovakia, from Hungary, from Yugoslavia. Nations that were, at that precise moment, sliding under Soviet dominion as the Red Army pressed west. The question of who receives the gold was completely entangled with the question of who governs the countries it was taken from. And that was a conversation no one in Washington or London wanted conducted in the open in April 1945. The alliance with Stalin was still officially functioning. The Pacific War still raged. American strategists were still calculating whether Soviet participation would be needed for the invasion of Japan. Giving gold back to Poland meant recognizing the Polish government in exile in London, which meant a direct collision with Stalin, who already had his own hand-picked Polish government waiting to install in Warsaw the instant fighting stopped. Nobody in Washington was prepared to pick that fight over bullion, not while larger confrontations loomed ahead. But that was only half the problem. Some of that gold hadn't traveled straight from European vaults into the Merker's mine. Some of it had passed through Switzerland first. The Swiss National Bank had accepted Nazi gold throughout the war without asking a single question, and portions of that gold had subsequently flowed into accounts linked to American and British financial institutions, firms that had maintained business relationships with Germany before the war, and in certain cases, discreetly during it. A full public audit of every bar in that mine, traced back to its point of origin, would have tugged on threads leading to places that extremely powerful and extremely respectable figures on both sides of the Atlantic had overwhelming reasons to leave undisturbed. This wasn't a conspiracy in the cinematic sense. It was something far more ordinary, and in many ways more unsettling. The people making decisions about the Merker's gold held personal and institutional stakes in ensuring certain questions never got asked too forcefully or answered too completely. Patton had zero interest in any of it. He genuinely, thoroughly, almost belligerently refused to care about diplomatic sensitivities or political entanglements or the financial anxieties of powerful men who'd made uncomfortable arrangements before the war. He cared about the soldiers who bled taking Germany apart. He cared about the people the Nazis had slaughtered. He cared about making sure stolen property went back to the people it was stolen from. And he said so, loudly, repeatedly, with a kind of raw bluntness that made him devastating on a battlefield and nearly ungovernable everywhere else. He demanded faster restitution. He demanded greater transparency. He demanded a complete public accounting of every item in that mine and every decision made about its fate afterward. He made enemies in Washington. He made enemies at the State Department. He made enemies among Allied administrators struggling to manage Germany's post-war transition, men who found Patton's insistence on doing the right thing publicly and noisily to be, as one internal memo phrased it, quote, zero. In September 1945, 5 months after uncovering the Merker's gold,
Patton was stripped of command of the Third Army.
The official justification was a press conference where he drew a comparison between Nazi party members and American political parties, Republicans and Democrats, arguing that former Nazis ought to be permitted to help run post-war Germany because they were the only ones who knew how. It was a reckless thing to say. Patton understood that the instant the words left his mouth. But the people who wanted him gone had been hunting for an excuse for months. He handed them one on a silver plate. They reassigned him to a hollow administrative role. No troops, no authority. His new job was writing a history of the war that nobody commissioned and nobody would read. He was 59 years old, the most effective battlefield commander America had ever produced, and they had quietly placed him on a shelf. 3 months later, December 9th,
1945. Patton sat in a staff car on a road outside Mannheim. A US Army truck, driven by a man named Robert Thompson, made an abrupt left turn and struck his vehicle. The impact was low speed. No one else in either vehicle suffered serious injury, but Patton's neck snapped. 12 days later, he was dead. The sole fatality of a collision that, by every measurable standard, should not have killed anyone. The details of that crash have drawn suspicion ever since. Robert Thompson gave contradictory accounts of what happened and why he turned when he did. A key witness named Frank Kupiaki later insisted the accident scene had been tampered with before investigators arrived. In 2008, a former OSS officer named Douglas Bazata claimed publicly that he had been contracted to assassinate Patton and that the car wreck had been staged. His account has never been fully corroborated, and historians remain split on its credibility. What no one disputes is this: Patton had been accumulating powerful enemies for months. He had been loud about his plans to return to America and enter politics. He had been openly hostile toward the post-war settlement being constructed around him. And his death arrived at precisely the moment when the people who found him dangerous had every reason to want him silent. Of the 250 tons of gold recovered at Merker's, a substantial portion was eventually returned to the nations it had been looted from, through a process that dragged on for decades and was never fully completed. Most of the artwork was recovered and repatriated, though certain pieces remain missing to this day, surfacing occasionally at auction houses under circumstances that provoke deeply uncomfortable questions. But the gold itself, the bars, the coins, the dental fillings, was never fully accounted for. Researchers working from declassified documents released in the 1990s estimated that somewhere between 10 and 20% of the total value from Merker's simply vanished in the months following the war's end. Some was pocketed by individual soldiers amid the chaos of the final weeks of combat. Some was seized by former Nazi officials who used it to bankroll their escapes to Argentina, Brazil, and Spain, funneled through rat lines organized with help from the Vatican and certain American intelligence officers. And some of it, according to those same declassified files, was quietly folded into post-war reconstruction accounts and intelligence budgets controlled by people who had powerful incentives to make sure nobody ever looked too closely at where the money originated. Patton found that gold. He fought to make the world aware of it. He demanded transparency and accountability
at exactly the moment when the people running things wanted neither. He was stripped of command, sidelined, then killed in an accident that has never been satisfactorily explained, in a country he had helped liberate 3 months before he planned to go home. The gold he uncovered remains unaccounted for 80 years later, and the full story of what happened to it and to him has still never been told.